Minister, I'm glad again to get the opportunity to speak to the issues of the disability sector and to follow up on the motion that regional group members brought to you, which you referenced here earlier today. This motion is about the access to public and private transport for people with disabilities and their carers. And it is based, as you've highlighted, around the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons, which Ireland has signed up with, and that was to provide access to transportation on an equal basis to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully. And I think disability is a very wide term that we use a lot, and it covers a lot of issues in terms of medical and clinical issues, and it's also related to an ageing population, as you know. And some people may be challenged from birth, some later on through illness or accident can have life-transforming accident or injury, which changes their situation and unfortunately puts them into the category of people living with disability. I think the first, it has to be recognised that the first aspiration that nearly all people with disability have, and with physical disability, is to be able to live as independently as possible, to be able to access work, and to be able to move within their communities and to have some mastery and independence over their lives. That's what they all wish, and we would wish that for them also. And safe travel, in the first instance, is a fundamental right and a requirement for people with a disability. And this can be either through their own private transport or public transport, but sadly the options are very limited, and that's what we're here today discussing. And in the private transport sector, as you know, Minister, people with a disability used to be able to secure a mobility allowance, and I think we need to see that reinstated again for people in that situation. And we speak of disability often in society, but those of us who are able-bodied, do we really know what we're talking about when we mention it? And I think if you're blind, as Michael Lowry has said, if you're hearing impaired, if you've got speech impediments, these are significant disadvantages. And if you add physical inability on top of that, these are very, very profound challenges that people face in life. And as I said, the need is for people to be able to participate in work, to be able to meet and communicate at the most basic of human needs. And if they're not able to do that, that brings very significant mental challenges. And I would like to commend some of the ministers, I think maybe yourself, Minister Rabbitte, earlier this year, some of our front bench colleagues were using a wheelchair in the chamber here for a day to try and understand what the life of a person living in a wheelchair is. And I think that's a really good initiative to give that perspective. But one of the things that's not understood well in terms of disability is the costs. And as you know, there has been a report engaged which shows that up to €9,000 could be the cost for a person who ends up being disabled or trying to access disability infrastructure. And I know I'd like to point out a disability person in my own area of Waterford ended up having in a wheelchair. They wanted to get a hoist put into their house. They were waiting almost 2 years to get a look at it, to get it approved. They finally went ahead because somebody else was buying a hoist that was approved. They put it into the house, and subsequently it took nearly 2 years for them to get the grant back for that. And you know, this is the kind of regulation that was just making it very difficult on people. And the same sometimes applies also to wheelchairs, Minister, and I think you probably know, again, you know, where people are making grants for wheelchairs, they can't buy anything in advance, and when they buy something in advance because they need it, oftentimes they find it difficult to get recompensed, and we have to do something about that. And I would also say, in terms of managing, I suppose, equality in terms of disability and transport, and in my own city of Waterford, we have quite a number of people who have taken on disabled taxi licences, and that's a great help. But the access to local link services, particularly when you get out into the rural areas, are very, very difficult. And I think we need to think about how people can get back to having a disabled driving scheme so that they can access their own private transport. Beyond that, I would point out, as I said, the replacement of the mobility allowance and also reinstating and amending the primary medical certificate is something we've called for in this motion. And also the reintroduction of a cash allowance that allows people with disabilities to engage some private transport where they have need. And I think also we do need further public information around, you know, how society can manage disability better. And I would point out to you, Minister, the idea of changing rooms and showering rooms, and there's very, very few of those in the country. And for instance, in my own town of Waterford, Tramore is very frequently visited, and we don't have as good a wheelchair scheme as they have in Wexford. We're trying to implement that, but one of the things we don't have is a showering room. And if you have somebody who's been in a wheelchair for, for a long period after a drive and what have you, and oftentimes they'll have accidents in terms of incontinence, there's no way to be able to provide services for them, and you can't bring them into hotels and all of that. The services are often not there. So I think, look, we need to have some kind of initiative around the country to provide a number of these in the high immunity areas. And the other point I made to Minister is just about dog fouling. And dog fouling is a particular problem for wheelchair users. And we need to have a better understanding of how we're going to raise fines and enforce fines for dog fouling. It is disgusting that people who are forced to have to get around in a wheelchair also have to deal with the ideas of dog fouling on their hands, bringing it into their houses and all the rest. It's totally unacceptable. And I think we do need a public information campaign around something like that. So, Ministers, look, what I'd say, we just need to get a lot more serious about, tackling disability. We do a lot to talk about the challenges. I'm glad to hear the Minister outline some of the further integration he's going to look at with members. We'd welcome that, and we'll certainly participate as wholesomely as possible.